and welcome to the second ever episode of Honors Spotlight, the podcast where we shine a light on the people, stories, and ideas shaping the MTSU honors experience and beyond. I'm your host, Robin Lee, and today's episode is one I've really been looking forward to. Constitution Day is next week, so in this episode, we're talking democracy. What it means, how we live it, why it matters, especially for students like you. And there's no better person to guide us through that conversation than Dr. Amy Sayward, Professor of History and the brand new Director of the American Democracy Project here at MTSU. Now, if you're not familiar with the American Democracy Project, don't worry. We're going to get into all of that, but what makes this episode really special is that we also explore Amy's personal journey from growing up in a military family to her early experiences with civic action as a teenager to the moment she realized just how powerful democratic engagement can be. We'll also dive into Constitution Day, why we celebrate it, what it means for our campus, and what you can expect from this year's keynote with none other than journalist and cultural commentator David Brooks. So grab your earbuds, settle in, and get ready for a deep and thoughtful conversation about civic life, personal responsibility, and the power of student voices as we get to know more about Amy. So let's jump in. Dr. Sayward, welcome to Honor Spotlight. We're excited to have you here.
I'm very excited to be here, Robin. Thank you.
Before we start discussing ADP and the upcoming Constitution Week events, I want to explore the history of the history professor now at the helm of it all. So, can you tell me a little bit about your background and your journey to MTSU?
I grew up north of Buffalo, New York. There's a whole county before you hit Canada. And so I don't believe in snow days. Now that I've moved to Tennessee, we have a lot of snow days. We didn't have a lot of snow days north of Buffalo, New York.
We have potential ice days here.
That is true. And so I'm the proud product of public schools. I went to the very same school. It was a central school from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade in a pretty rural area. And that's actually where I first got involved with civic action.
So what first sparked your interest in democracy and civic life?
So I remember as an elementary student, our school was a polling place. And before you had electronic polling places, it was the old machines where you pulled the levers. And we would vote for our student council in elementary school. So we'd all go out and we'd line up to use those voting machines to vote for who we wanted for student council. And I thought it was the coolest thing ever.
So could you see who other people were voting for? Or was
Oh, no. No, when you pulled the lever, it closed the curtain behind you. And then when you finished voting, pulling each of the levers, it would record it when you open the curtain again.
Okay, and so you had told me earlier about this personal story from high school and your first experience really with democracy in action beyond your elementary school days. So kind of share that with everybody.
Yeah. So when I was a senior in high school, in New York State, voters voted for our school budget. And a lot of times people don't like more taxes, and so routinely the school budget got voted down. But it was sort of odd because you weren't really voting on the entire school budget. You were really only voting on the discretionary portion. So after the school budget would fail, then they would break out the different sections. And so that was school buses, and that was home and shop supplies, library books, and athletics. And so usually folks would vote in support of school buses and athletics, and we'd move forward. And for years, we didn't get new supplies for shops or home ec, but that was just how we moved forward. But my senior year, the head of the school board took out a full-page ad in the local newspaper and said that people shouldn't vote for the school budget, even though he had helped to put it together. And athletics didn't pass that year. Nothing that wasn't state mandated came into play. So our principal had to set up how every family, every individual would pay for the sports that you played. So it made things a little rough, a little chaotic for our senior year. And then moving into graduation, one of my friends who was head of the student government said, "Hey, do you know that at graduation, the person who hands us our diplomas is the head of the school board, Mr. I won't mention his name, the person who had actively lobbied against the school budget." So we're like, well, that stinks. So he said, well, let's go to the school board meeting and ask that the retiring elementary school principal give us our diplomas instead. And so three of us, the head of the Honor Society, the head of the student government, and the head of the student council, we went and we sat through the whole 2-hour and 45-minute school board meeting until they got to new business. And then they said, are there any new business? So we stood up and we said, we respectfully request that Dr. Bianchi give us our diplomas. And we sat down. And you would think that that would be the end of it, except it's a small town. And on the front page of the next day's newspaper, it said seniors balk at getting diplomas. And then there followed a whole series of letters to the editor in which lots of people said that we had no right to an opinion, that we didn't vote for the school budget, we didn't pay school taxes, and so we weren't entitled to an opinion. And this struck me as really odd and contrary to everything I'd learned in school, that we are training you to be citizens and leaders in the future and to critically think and all of those things. One piece of feedback that we really took to heart, someone said, well, these are not representatives of the senior class. They're only the head of the Honor Society, the Student Council, and the class president. So they said we weren't representative. So we wrote a petition, and all but 7 of the 177 members of the senior class said, yes, we would like Dr. Bianchi to give us our diplomas.
Right, and just to be clear, Dr. Bianchi is not the superintendent that shall not be named.
That is correct. That is correct. We will leave him out of the story. So then we went to the next school board meeting, which the school board was going to make the decision about who was going to give us diplomas. Before we got to that item on the agenda, the head of the school board stood up and he said, I refuse to give diplomas to this class. A bunch of troublemakers will probably ruin the ceremony for everyone. Which I thought was kind of odd since, we were the, leaders of our senior class, never been in trouble in our whole life sort of thing. So he declined to give us diplomas. So that, was a little bit of a victory. But what I'm most proud of and what really resonated with me was our senior class, about half of whom, were 18 before we graduated. We decided to do a voter registration drive. But as soon as we're 18, we can vote. We can vote on the school budget. And that next fall, for the first time in 25 years, the school budget passed on the first vote. So because we were active, because we cared about the issue, because we cared to vote, we changed things in that community, at least for that year.
That is awesome. So you come from a military family. So how did that shape your views on service and civic engagement?
So both of my grandfathers served in World War II. Specifically, they both had 2 children before they joined the military. So both of my parents were born towards the end of the war. But, in World War II, and now I teach a course on World War II. And it really was a time where everyone was mobilized. Everyone recognized that they were part of this sort of shared conflict, not only in the United States, but, across the world. And they made huge sacrifice. I kid my dad that he was a deployment baby. He was born while my grandfather was deployed fighting in Germany with the United States Army. And when my grandfather got back to the United States, my father was 2. So for 2 years, he was away from his family. I have all the letters that my grandma and grandpa Sayward exchanged while they were apart. I remember it was odd during the Persian Gulf War. I was watching the news with my grandma. I was visiting her, and it was an episode about military spouses, and they were talking about how stressful it was not being able to communicate every day with their spouses. And my grandmother threw up her hands, and she's like, every day? I was lucky if I got a letter a month from Europe. So, certainly times have changed, communication technologies have changed. But, it was a super stressful time for everyone in the nation. And my grandma Angevine went and worked Grandpa Angevine's job at IBM while he was deployed. Lots of moving around, lots of just doing the best that you can. My grandma Sayward taught school and had 2 toddlers. So trying to, keep the family working, keep everything moving forward during the war. And so certainly those were things that I grew up hearing all of those stories. My father also served in the Vietnam War. and my brother served in between wars with the United States Navy. But knowing the difficulties that come with being apart from family, talking about Sayward's complaining about communication technology, my father one day was complaining to my grandmother that he had not heard from my brother for a week. And she said, "Oh yeah, it's really difficult when your son is deployed to a war zone and you don't hear from him regularly." Wink, wink. She was really talking about him, who didn't think it was important to send her letters all the time. He's like, "Oh, nothing's really happening."
It's easy to see that you are very passionate about history just from your experiences growing up. And another one of those interesting personal tidbits that you and I have talked about previously, you graduated from the same high school as Timothy McVeigh. I think you said he graduated either the year before or the year after you. Mm-hmm. How did learning about that connection affect you and how you engage with history?
Yeah, Timothy McVeigh graduated the year ahead of me in 1986. And it always surprises people that he was voted best smile for his class, right? So he was a guy who always has a smile for everyone, which obviously doesn't fit with the life that he pursued afterward. It always struck me as very odd that someone who had grown up in the same community. Literally, Mr. McVeigh lived, if you went to the end of my parents' road and hung a left, Mr. McVeigh lived right there, and he continued to live there. That someone who went to the same school, lived in the same community, went to the church down the street, capable of carrying out that type of activity, blowing up the Murrah building, killing 177 people, I think it was, including a number of children who were in the daycare on the bottom floor of the Murrah building. It got me thinking very much about motivations. I was already a historian working on my PhD at Ohio State, but it also got me thinking later about the death penalty because, of course, he was sentenced to death for his crime. And it was the first time that I actually got to thinking about the death penalty and got me involved with some anti-death penalty organizations, first in Ohio and then in Tennessee subsequently. So I've also been working with nonprofits, the Tennessee Coalition to Abolish State Killing, which is now Tennesseans for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. I've been active with them since I moved to Tennessee in 1998.
So that personal journey really kind of lays the foundation for the work you do now. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about your role as an educator. You've taught history at MTSU for a year, so how do you encourage civic participation in your classroom?
So ever since I started, I always have given extra credit for being a registered voter. I say the history, especially the history of the United States, is the history of Americans seeking to exercise government and to vote. And when we look at American history from its foundation to the present, that continues to be a common motif. I always see history as very much a present endeavor, not something that just happened in the past, but things that we're molding today. And so I've always given extra credit for registering to vote. And then when MTSU moved to EXL, our experiential learning, I began to include as well students working with groups that were promoting socio-political change. So I've had students who, during that phase, who volunteered with the Tennessee Right to Life organization, who have lobbied their legislators, who have done door-to-door canvassing around health insurance issues. So involving themselves with groups that have promoted socio-political change in the present day as they were studying groups that had promoted socio-political change in American history, so that they saw the continuities and discontinuities between the past and what was happening today, so that history wasn't just something that happened in the past, but something very much happening in the future that they had the ability to shape and change.
Yeah. And I think every generation has their historical moment or moments that kind of define their lives and shape who they become. And it's that moment that they'll always remember for, honestly, the average age of college students now were born after 9/11 happened, and so you're kind of still wondering what their turning point historical moment is going to be. So why do you think it's important for students to engage with democracy, both in and out of the classroom?
Well, especially students, college students here at MTSU, obviously training to be the leaders of our industry, of government, of communities, of families, of our societies. And so part of that training, especially as we become educated leaders, critical thinkers, that's exactly what we need to sustain our democracy. Our founding fathers knew it, and every generation since, that the people that we most need to be involved in and interested in government for it to continue to be a vibrant democracy are the folks who think about it, who care about it, who are willing to, put themselves on the line. Every single person should vote because we need the input of every single person to get the best possible outcome. So especially here at MTSU, our students, most of them are going to stay in the region, will be leaders in their communities and such. And so I want them to get practice with registering to vote, because you have to re-register every time you move, voting, being educated voters, researching what's going to happen before you go into the polling place. A couple of years ago, we had several constitutional amendments on the ballot. And so in class, we went through each of them and why they were needed, what they meant. And one of my students reported back and she's like, Dr. Sayward, I went into the voting booth and I was in and out in like 2 minutes. And all these other people were like, what is this? What is this? I can't believe they didn't do their homework before they went. And so, having those good practices of knowing where to get the information, looking it up, making up their mind, talking to other people before they move forward.
Just being educated citizens.
And sometimes it can be a little harder to find that information. In Tennessee, when we were voting in the presidential primary, you don't actually vote directly for who you want in the presidential primary, but who the delegates to the convention will be and who they represent. And there were more people than minimum number you had to choose. So we talked through that process. Again, if you just walk in and say, oh, I want to vote for candidate X, and you don't get to vote for candidate X, but you vote for X number of delegates, how do you make that decision if you haven't thought about it ahead of time, if you haven't done a little bit of research on it?
Absolutely. It's inspiring to hear how much thought you've put into helping students become engaged citizens. And that's a perfect lead into one of the major ways students can get involved in civic life on campus, the American Democracy Project. So for listeners who aren't familiar, what is ADP?
So the American Democracy Project was an initiative of the American Association of State Colleges and Universities a quarter century ago. They said one of the key parts of our mission as regional state colleges and universities is to train our leaders for the future. And a key part of that is civic engagement. So we need to be doing a better job, more consciously helping our students think about how to be civically engaged. Not just registering to vote and voting, but also how do you involve yourself in your community, and also realizing that those students who are more involved in their community, doing more community-based learning, more civically engaged, had a more positive experience in their education. Getting outside the classroom has been very valuable to students. And so ASCU, the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, has put this emphasis on civic engagement at all of its member institutions. And once a year we get together and we share ideas. Just got back from Indianapolis with 3 faculty members and 6 undergraduate students who made their own presentation about how they engage with democracy every day. So we have an American Democracy Project student organization. They run voter registration drives. They do presentations at national conferences. And they have organized for the fall a issues forum in which we're going to look at a number of issues that impact specifically MTSU students and understand where the different political parties disagree on those different issues. So that's part of it. The ADP student organization has been great already to be able to work with them.
So how did it feel stepping into this role after Dr. Mary Evans, who led the program for nearly 2 decades?
So it's a fun story that I was chair of the history department when Dr. Evans became the American Democracy Project director. So I was approached by the previous director who said, "Hey, I think Dr. Evans would be a good director." I said, "She'd be a great director." And so both the former director and myself went and talked to the provost and said, "This is the person who should be the ADP director." And Dr. Evans did such a great job of making Constitution Day on our campus such a broad and anticipated event. Not only do we have, national level speakers for Constitution Day like David Brooks, who's coming, Vice President Pence, who was here last year, but also every one of the colleges participates in reading the Constitution out loud every year during Constitution Week. And they sound a little odd, like, why would we do that? But it's so fundamental to our democracy to not only know the Constitution generally, but to be more familiar with its specific parts, to be able to, when someone says, that's unconstitutional, to really know what's in the Constitution and how things fit or don't fit, how our Constitution is written and how it's functioned over the last almost 250 years.
Absolutely. And I know that's reading the Constitution outside in front of one of the college buildings is something that they're always going to remember. And for the Honors College, we also give them cupcakes after they read. I don't know what the other buildings do, but
So everyone should come to the Honors College.
So what excites you the most about the future of ADP?
The future of ADP, what excites me most is what has excited me for 27 years of being at MTSU. I am always so excited to meet our freshmen, to meet our students, and to imagine what they're going to do next. I've had, the honor and privilege over these last 27 years to work with thousands of students and to see them go on to careers in the legislature and classrooms and their community. And every once in a while, when you're here long enough, folks will circle back and say, "Hey, do you remember me? Are you still on campus? Can I come visit you?" And I had a student just recently who came to visit Jason, who I had in class like 20 years ago. And he said, "Do you remember me?" I said, "I remember that you were tall and dark hair. I probably couldn't have picked you out of a lineup." But he said, "Do you remember, the positions that I took in class?" I'm like, "No, it was a little too long ago." He's like, "I have changed so much over the years, in part because I kept learning." And he said, "I always remember in class, we could never nail you down on what was your position. You would always ask us questions to clarify our own positions." And he said, that always just sort of stuck with me. And he said, if I had a chance to go back and talk to my 22-year-old self, I'd be like, "What are you thinking?" So what excites me always is the future, which is probably ironic for someone who's a historian and studies the past.
I think it makes perfect sense. So clearly ADP is doing powerful work to connect students with real-world democratic engagement. And a big part of that centers around something we all know but don't always think deeply about, perhaps, and that's the Constitution. So why is Constitution Day important, especially on a college campus?
It's actually federally mandated that we mark and celebrate Constitution Day, which I think is wonderful because I don't think that we think about the Constitution enough on a daily basis. Again, it's a term that we throw around a lot, especially things being constitutional or unconstitutional. Once you really sort of start digging in, thinking about the intellectual work that was done by that founding generation to decide how do we create a document that is broad enough that it can govern this future that we can't quite imagine, but not specific enough so that it'll only apply to us. I'm always struck by sort of the genius of that founding generation and their ability to craft our Constitution and include in it that amendment process, to realize that it would have to change over time. And that they couldn't quite imagine how or when, but they put a process into place. I think that's the genius of the document. And it's also the reason why we continue to have our courts functioning to interpret, because they left room for ambiguity or change over time, and recognize that 250 years, well, I'm sure that they could not have imagined that 250 years later we'd still be operating with the same Constitution, with just one huge constitutional crisis, the Civil War, and a lot of amendments over the years. I actually did some research on the 26th Amendment that lowered the voting age, the early 1970s, and came to realize that two young men who had just recently graduated college were the two Tennessee legislators, the youngest members of the legislature, who were responsible for getting Tennessee to ratify the 26th Amendment on the very first day that it was open for signature. Victor Ashe and Richard Krieg. I had the honor this past fall of being on a panel with them and having them tell their stories at the East Tennessee Historical Society about 52 years after they had played that pioneering role in pushing for the youth vote. It was so inspiring to get to meet them and talk to them about that experience and how, as they said, we did our homework better than some of the more established legislatures.
They sound like very neat people to meet. So this year's theme focuses on how constitutional values intersect with student voices and identities. What does that mean for you?
What it means to me is that every student needs to be thinking about the Constitution, thinking about how it shapes the world around them, and how they may well shape the next generation, and how that Constitution is interpreted. There's lots of language in it. I love the preamble to the Constitution that lays out those broad sort of ideas. Especially, I'm a big fan of the very first word of the Constitution, we. I think a lot of times people talk today about how polarized we are. I would like us as Americans to spend more time thinking about what we share rather than what divides us. I think we'd be a lot happier, and we'd probably be moving forward in a little more concerted of an effort these days.
Yeah, absolutely. So what ways do you think students can live out constitutional values in their daily lives?
So again, if I go back to we, thinking about, when we hear disagreements between different political parties or even different people or groups on campus, again, to start by thinking about, well, what do we share? What's the common ground that we have? What are our shared values that can help guide us and move us forward? And we do that every day in the classroom as we work with other people who may not share the same ideas that we do. We can learn from one another and learn how to work together regardless of some differences and realize the things that we share in common every day.
So you've given us a lot to think about when it comes to living out constitutional values. So let's talk about how all of that kind of comes to life at MTSU, starting with this year's Constitution Week events. Can you give us a quick overview of Constitution Day at MTSU this year?
So Constitution Day is September 17th. It's a Wednesday this year, and that's when our big sort of speaker and event will be on campus. David Brooks will be talking to student members of ADP's organization, talking about the role of the Constitution in their everyday lives. That'll be at 3 o'clock in the Tucker Theater. That event is free and open to the public. Everyone is invited, and after sort of the initial questions and answers, we will throw open the floor for questions. The public is also welcome to the reception that will follow immediately, so they'll also have an opportunity, if they so wish, to intersect and interact with Mr. Brooks as well as the students who will have been on stage. So that's at 3 o'clock on Wednesday, September 17th. Mr. Brooks will also be reading the Constitution along with the College of Liberal Arts and the College of Basic and Applied Sciences at 1 o'clock in the Peck Hall courtyard. We would love for members of the community as well as everyone on campus to participate in reading the Constitution at some point on Constitution Week. The College of Media and Entertainment and the Walker Library will be hosting a Constitution Day reading Monday, September 15th at 11 o'clock. 3 o'clock is when the Honors College with cupcakes or cookies, cupcakes, we'll be reading at 3 o'clock. Tuesday, the College of Education and University College will be reading the Constitution at 9 o'clock in the morning at the College of Education Portico. And so we have Constitution readings taking place throughout the first part of the week as well.
So what can students expect from David Brooks' keynote address?
So he's not giving a set address. He will be having a conversation with students from the ADP student organization about some of the key ideas that he has laid out, both about the Constitution in general, current politics, and in his writings, he's written a lot about the development of character and being sort of a good, solid American in terms of values. When I took the ADP student organization up to Indianapolis last month, I said, this is what I'd like to have happen, that all of you are interacting with him. And one of the students said, his book on the Second Mountain changed my life. And I said, then you absolutely have to draft a question around how that idea of not just our original career goals, but as we sort of climb that career ladder and we see, as he says in his analogy, the mountain behind, the things that we want to accomplish for our communities, to make the world that we leave behind a better place than the one we inherited. Those are what I see as good constitutional values. So he'll also be talking about those as well.
Wonderful. So how can students get involved in American Democracy Project or even the Constitution Day activities?
So our student organization website is awesome. You can go on to student organizations and scroll through, I think the last count, there are like 180 different student organizations that students can belong to. Everything from a knitting club to the American Democracy Project to the swim club, all types of student organizations. And I think it's really one of the best ways to connect with peers across campus, to be connected to others who share similar interests, and to find sort of your people as you settle in to the college campus.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Honors Spotlight, and a huge thank you to Amy Sayward for sharing her insights, stories, and passion for civic engagement in the Constitution. If you're curious about how to get involved in the American Democracy Project or Constitution Day events, visit amerdem.mtsu.edu or stop by the Honors College for more information. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Honors Spotlight. We hope you enjoyed getting to know the people, passions, and stories that make the MTSU Honors College so unique. If you like what you heard, be sure to subscribe, leave us a review, and share the podcast with others. You can also follow the Honors College on social media to stay up to date on future episodes and events. To learn more about honors at MTSU, visit honors.mtsu.edu. Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep being extraordinary.